Okay, perfect. Do you have a notification that says Youri's recording the call?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And I am joined by first-time guest. I'm joined by Jeff Cohen, who's part of a fantastic organization, online campaigning organization called rootsaction.org. And he was the founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, fair.org, which is one of the greatest media critic organization that holds the corporate media to account. And Jeff also was a media commentator and a panelist on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and was the producer of the very short-lived show Donahue Live with the very legendary Phil Donahue. And he was the author, Jeff was also the author of The Way Things Aren't to Be, or The Way Things Ought to Be, Rush Limbaugh's Reign of Air, which he co-wrote with his colleagues at the time, Steve Randall, Jim Necros, who currently runs FAIR, and also was the author of this brilliant book, Cable News Confidential: My Misadventures in Corporate Media, which I really do recommend people read. And who knows, if we have time, we're going to get into some of Jeff's misadventures in the corporate media.
Sounds good.
And so first of all, Mr. Cohen, thank you for coming on the program on such short notice.
You're very welcome.
It's an honor to have you. And just before I get into some of the issues I wanted to talk to you about, because we're short on time, talk to us about you're going to be participating in a panel for World Beyond War. Their rebirth regeneration. I think I'm saying that right, but yeah, their big conference that's going to be happening from July 8th to the 10th. You're going to be part of a panel. Tell us what that panel is going to be discussing, and why people, if they have the time, they should definitely join.
Yeah, I encourage people to go to that 3-day virtual event, 2 or 3 days. And I think I'm on Sunday afternoon or Sunday noonish, Eastern New York time. We'll be talking about how to challenge mainstream media. What does peace journalism and progressive independent journalism look like? These are issues I've grappled with for too many decades.
Fantastic. And yes, and I had both David Swanson and Greta Zara on the program to promote those events. And yes, people should definitely check that out. And so while I have you, the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is, now I know that you and people like Professor Noam Chomsky, the late Ed Herman, and of course the organization you founded, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, spent a lot of time criticizing the corporate, the corporate media, and of course anyone who knows the brilliant theses of FAIR is that don't trust the corporate media. In this day and age, how do you assess the role of corporate media? Would you say it's gotten worse, not just on the domestic issues, but of course foreign policy? How do you assess the corporate media, but also the fact that even left-leaning media also seems to have jumped the shark on a lot of issues, like the anti-Russia conspiracy theories, the support for NATO, supporting R2P nonsense in Syria, and the whole Assad must go, even though America is supporting non-existent moderate rebels.
Right.
And all of those issues. So how do you assess the corporate media's role in that, and the fact that even left-leaning media has jumped the shark on those some of those topics?
Right. Well, let's parse out what the media system is. I would say the corporate mainstream media spans from the corporate center, that's MSNBC, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, to the right wing, which would be Fox News, Breitbart. Within the corporate media system, the mainstream media system, I would argue things have gotten worse. In 2003, right before the invasion of Iraq, FAIR did a famous survey of who was allowed on the main television news shows on the four biggest channels: ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS, allegedly public television. And it was a 2-week survey who was allowed to speak about the proposed invasion of Iraq in an allegedly democratic society and who wasn't. And this was 1 week before Colin Powell's speech to the United Nations and 1 week after. And during those 2 weeks, 393 people were allowed to spout off on the impending invasion of Iraq, and only 3 were anti-war voices. So that's less than 1%. That's a fraction of 1%. One could argue in the run-up to the horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine that things are even worse. In that, I think I was monitoring it closely, and of the hundreds and hundreds of voices in the run-up to Russia's horrific invasion of Ukraine, there was virtually no dissent. I don't even think it was a fraction of 1%. There was no one, for example, who said that maybe the US should declare and NATO should declare that Ukraine will not join NATO. Yeah. Now, I don't know whether that would have stopped the invasion. Maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't. But on its own terms, there are a lot of people, including members of the former military-industrial complex, who believe that Ukraine joining NATO was wrong and should never have been allowed and should never have been discussed beginning years ago. But that history, where, in the 1990s, some of the most powerful figures in the military-industrial complex said, because of the pledges that were made by the Bush 1 administration and the Clinton administration to the Soviet and then Russian leadership, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. There were many establishment figures in the 90s who said NATO should not expand 1 inch eastward. Yeah. And indeed, we should come up with a different security arrangement for Europe that doesn't involve power blocks and does not involve NATO, or certainly an expanded NATO. So my point is that in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, we had a fraction of 1% dissenting voices allowed in the mainstream media. In the run-up to Russia's invasion, illegal, aggressive war on Ukraine, they didn't allow any. I counted no fraction of even 1% of dissenting views. So one could argue things have gotten worse. Now, the independent media, which is what I studied when I was a journalism professor at Ithaca College, independent media in our country has consistently grown since the invasion of Iraq, partly because the mainstream media were as complicit in all the lies that led to the invasion of Iraq. And I think independent media, whether it's truthout.org, Common Dreams, Democracy Now!, The Intercept, they were putting on one dissenting view after another in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. They did allow a debate. So I'm proud of the independent journalistic media in our country, the non-conglomerated media, but it's tiny compared to the corporate centrist media or the right-wing corporate media. It's grown a lot since 2003, but it's still dwarfed by the corporate centrist and right-wing media that dominates our media system. We don't have public broadcasting like you do in Europe. Our public broadcasting is privatized. It's weak. It doesn't allow very much dissent any more than the corporate outlets. In Europe, you can occasionally have dissenting views in public television and public radio. It's very rare in our country because we have such weak public broadcasting, and it's controlled by the government, and that the government has to appropriate money every year or two. The Republicans say they're going to cut off all funds to public broadcasting. As a result, public broadcasting gets even more timid than they were the year before. It's very dysfunctional.
Although I would take issue that that public television is is great in Europe, because just take the example of Ukraine, or the war in Libya, or just the or just the topic of NATO itself. Most of the corporate media, public, state-run media or state-subsidized media, all of them are lock, stock, Putin is evil incarnate, therefore we need to have a war with him. NATO is a force for good in the world. There's a refugee crisis, but you know what? We did good in Libya because Gaddafi was about to massacre his people, and we have to continue on with the course in Syria.
Right, but there's occasionally dissenting views, which in our public television, we didn't see any difference between public television and the corporate outlets in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, and virtually no difference. I mean, in what I get in the English version of France, Channel 24 in English, and I was monitoring some of it in the run-up to the Russian invasion, and they were actually providing once in a while a point of view that said, well, the Russian perspective is that they've been encroached and they were lied to. I never heard that in U.S. media at all, even for 60 seconds.
Interesting. But that's a very interesting segue into, because you were saying that corporate media has gotten worse, and I completely agree with you. And I would say, from Britain to Australia to New Zealand to all the countries, the media, the media just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. How do you reflect on, why do you think when it comes to the left-leaning movement, we don't seem to have people who are consistently anti-war? It's more selectively anti-war. So once upon a time, Iraq, which had global protests, people protesting the war before the invasion even went down, the slogan was plain and simple: no war for oil. And people could acknowledge that, yes, Saddam Hussein did once upon a time use weapons of mass destruction, not just on Iran, but on his own people. And people would mention, but he was backed by the United States, and he was backed by France and Germany and so forth, and Britain. But now, when it comes, when it comes to the invasion of Libya, there was no no war for oil, or the various attempts to overthrow Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. There is no war for oil, as well as the attempts to again overthrow the Daniel Ortega Sandinista government. And then, of course, Syria is another great example of that. But so how do you respond to that?
Yeah, you and I would probably disagree on Nicaragua and some other places, but I'm clearly an anti-imperialist. So I don't see the U.S. as a force for good in the world, as a force for peace or human rights or democracy. Having said that, that's why I'm no longer on television. If you believe there is such a thing as U.S. imperialism, and that it's a bad thing, you are excluded from mainstream media. To go on a deeper level, the U.S. left, and that's why I encourage people to sign up with Roots Action and groups like World Beyond War, which is more transnational. But rootsaction.org welcomes people from other countries. We're mostly a U.S. group, and we are against U.S. imperialism. We are against U.S. militarism. We were against the expansion of NATO. We are against these sanctions on Venezuela. So we are somewhat unique in the US left, because even the leading political figures of the left, like Bernie Sanders, he just doesn't discuss foreign policy much. When he does, it's often quite dovish, but he basically just campaigns on domestic issues, even though, the US is 4% of the global population, as David Swanson, who works for both Roots Action and World Beyond War, is always pointing out. We're 4% of the global population, but our government insists on basically running the globe. So knowing that the US has this kind of global reach, one would hope that the political leaders, the electoral leaders of the left, whether it's Bernie Sanders or AOC or Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, I wish they focused a little more on foreign policy. I don't know that that would help them anymore getting, building their base or getting elected, but it's the morally right thing to do. And we have a situation in our country where if you care about the domestic issues, like why is it that the United States is the only advanced country that doesn't have universal health care, the only advanced industrial country that doesn't have free or inexpensive higher education? It's because all of the money, most of the discretionary funding, goes to our war machine. Everyone knows it. So,
and if you're an environmentalist, also the biggest polluter, and those wars are for oil and mining, which is more of a
no doubt about it. So, Roots Action, at our core, we're a peace and justice group. We don't believe you can fight for the multiracial working class in the United States without fighting against the US war machine. That's the signature issue of rootsaction.org. And we work closely with World Beyond War and Code Pink and other groups like that. But because we have a toe in the Bernie movement, which is the biggest electoral left thrust in decades, certainly since Jesse Jackson and perhaps even bigger, we are always trying to push that broad Bernie movement to address foreign policy more, to challenge US militarism more. And that's the role that we play. And in that, getting back to the media issue, we do believe that we have allies in the independent media. Democracy Now! Often gives voice to peace advocates. commondreams.org, truthout.org, theintercept.com, even salon.com gives voice to the peace movement and to peace advocates. Norman Solomon and I, who founded Roots Action, our columns are often in these news outlets. And most of our columns are about US militarism and US imperialism. So I don't want to paint with a broad brush. Most independent, progressive news outlets in this country, while they may not agree with you on Ortega, or they are generally against US imperialism and want to debate about that. They're generally against US sanctions on all these governments. It's certainly something that Roots Action has campaigned for, is for a new foreign policy. And if it wasn't for these independent progressive news outlets, we wouldn't have anything. We would be as marginalized as the US Green Party, and thankfully we are not.
And some reflections on the censorship of RT. Now, and I want your reflections on RT.
Well, I mean, I used to appear on RT a lot, RT America. I used to think it was somewhat of a joke network in that, you could never criticize Putin, but they want you to come on to criticize the censorship in US media. And if I was on live, I would say, look, censorship is happening in China, it's happening in Russia, and here's how it's happening in the US. Now, if I wasn't on live, they would censor me on RT. But if I was on live, I would try to point out that I'm against media censorship of peace points of view, whatever the country is. And clearly the Russian militarists are censoring the anti-war voices in Russia. You know, people are being locked away, people are being silenced, and the Russian media is just abjectly censorial, perhaps even more in lockstep than the US mainstream media, because sometimes, you know, if we yelled loud enough, they would show a snippet of our anti-war marches during the invasion of Iraq. It would be a snippet. Yeah. We would never be invited into the studio. The critique that we've made at fair.org, and I encourage all of your viewers to sign up to get the alerts every day or every other day from fair.org, the Media Watch group. But at fair.org, we would talk about how when the mainstream media ever acknowledged that there was this massive anti-war movement during the invasion of Iraq, we would only be shown in our natural habitat out in the street with our fists in the air, chanting sometimes asinine slogans. But we were never allowed into the studio where we could show we really know what the issues are, and here's a serious debate about the US war machine. That was not allowed to happen. So I would argue that the mainstream media suppression in Russia is probably even worse, because they don't show even, you know, us with our fists in the air as was happening in the US. So I'm for...
So solidarity for RT, no to censorship, but like solidarity for RT despite whatever flaws.
I wish we had access to RT. I wish we had access to more foreign, even if they're government controlled, more foreign networks. But I tended to find RT was becoming somewhat of a joke. That they, you know, I'm against all imperialisms. You know, the biggest imperialism, the most powerful, is the US. We have 750 bases, overseas bases in nearly 80 countries. I think Russia has a couple dozen overseas bases in about 6 countries. So I'm against all imperialisms, but I understand that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is what we would, you know, what's happened in our country for centuries, where the US invades neighbors to take part of its land or to institute a friendly government, engages in all sorts of war crimes. And that's what Russia has done in Ukraine. So I'm opposed to Russia's imperialism in Ukraine. What's fascinating is, in the New York Times, US imperialism cannot appear in the newspaper except in scare quotes, casting doubts on whether it exists or not. But you can talk about Russian imperialism all you want. So it's sort of silly. But again, as someone who is truly anti-war, like World Beyond War is and Roots Action is, and I'm against war no matter who is perpetrating the aggression, you know, that's why I'm a critic of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, even though I'm also a critic of NATO. But it doesn't justify what Russia has done in Ukraine. It's barbaric.
Actually, before I get to this question about Julian Assange, what would you say, though, to some of the voices, some of the anti-imperialist voices who say, I completely agree with you, Jeff. You know, I don't think it helps Russia's case invading Ukraine, but Russia was backed against the wall because of NATO expansion, and there was a Western-backed coup in Ukraine that installed a very hostile government, which has empowered movements which lionize you know, Nazis and Nazi collaborators, and that Zelensky.
Well, what I would say is, I know all the arguments. Either you're against war and imperialism or you're not. I'm against war and imperialism. So I'm against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm for empowering the United Nations. I'm for diplomacy first. I mean, I've read the speeches of Putin where he talked basically that Ukraine and the Ukrainians are part of greater Russia. He sounds like a czar. So if you're against, and I agree with you on the criticism of NATO, and I was a leading critic of NATO expansion going back decades. That does not justify what happened, what Putin is doing, the killing of civilians. Ukraine is not a Nazi regime. You know, it's just silly. Are there neo-Nazis in the military establishment? Has Azov battalion been in court? Yes, everyone knows it's not a Nazi regime. And in my view, there's no justification for what Putin has done. And now and the imprisoning. If you're anti-war, you're sympathetic with these thousands of anti-war voices in Russia that have been repressed. It's not because they're uninformed or they're tools of US imperialism. They are getting the news about the horrific killing of civilians in Ukraine by the Russian war machine and the Russian aerial bombardment. Now, to put it in perspective, in the US media, we never heard about civilian victims of the US war in Iraq or in Afghanistan. And the military expert, the independent expert in our country is William Arkin. He says there were more bombing sorties and missile strikes in the first day of the US attack on Iraq, the first day of shock and awe, than in the first 3 weeks of the Russian bombardment of Ukraine. And we never heard about all the civilians dying. There were many women in Iraq that were on the verge of giving birth, and they did so while the aerial bombardment, perhaps the worst in modern history, perpetrated by the US war machine, was happening. So the coverage in our country was a complete censorship. But the bombardment, the terror that has rained down on Ukrainians, civilians, is indefensible. And the repression against anti-war voices in Russia is indefensible. I know all the arguments that I hear from apologists for Putin's invasion. I don't buy them. I've heard them all. I know them all. And again, I'm a critic of NATO. I'm a critic of NATO's expansion and was years and years ago. That doesn't justify what's happening. And I'm with World Beyond War and Code Pink and Roots Action when I say, if you're against war, you have to denounce the Putin aggression against Ukraine, and I do.
All righty. Well, in the future, I'll definitely have to have another person to debate that, because there is a lot, because there is some. I hope it's not bitter divisions, but there are some divisions.
Well, then quit. Yeah, that's fine, but quit calling themselves anti-war. You can't justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine and say you're against war. I mean, unless you believe it's what does Putin call it, a special operation. I mean, that's nonsense. I came into politics when the racist war against Vietnam was happening. And it was not a declared war. They didn't get the Congress to declare war. And so the mainstream media obediently called it a conflict. It almost, it wasn't called a war. A war was happening, but it wasn't called a war. So I'm one of these people that, being anti-war, I believe you tell the truth. Noam Chomsky, Ed Herman, the rest of us, we tell the truth. We don't bullshit around because Putin was, quote, backed into a corner. Some of that's true, some of it isn't. You still have to tell the truth. A war is going on. Ukrainian civilians are being bombarded and terrorized, just like Iraqi civilians were terrorized by US imperialism. I'm against all imperialisms, all military aggressions.
All righty. Well, we'll definitely have that debate in the future, and I just want to also say that that even though I do understand some of those arguments of why Russia invaded Ukraine, I also do think that how can I say, it's made us trying to argue against the warmongers in our respective countries, whether it's Western Europe, the United States, and Canada, all the more, all the more difficult. In fact,
but you don't.
World Beyond. In
Yeah,
fact, World Beyond War is even. I'm even going to be moderating a debate on whether wars are ever justifiable with David Swanson and Arnold August. And I know for a fact the very thorny issue of Ukraine and Russia will definitely be.
right.
Right.
I'm just saying, if
Yeah.
you want to apologize for what Putin is doing and the terror raining down on the Ukrainian people, don't call yourself anti-war. Don't say you're against imperialism. You may be against U.S. imperialism, but you may be apologizing for Russian aggression and Russian imperialism. So I'm just saying that if you're going to be anti-war, and I'm not a pacifist, but I'm anti-war, and I've been anti-war since I opposed the U.S. aggression against Vietnam, the racist, almost genocidal aggression. I've been anti-war my whole life and anti-U.S. imperialist. That doesn't mean that every regime that U.S. imperialism criticizes, that I wrap myself around those regimes 110%. I defend them against U.S. imperialism. I defend them against U.S. sanctions, but I don't necessarily say, oh, these are great regimes overseas.
Very fair. Actually, one final follow-up then about that. Then what would... Okay. If hypothetically, if you were an advisor to Putin and you did have this aggressive neighbor who wants to join NATO, and of course, because you mentioned you're against NATO and NATO expansion, what do you, and if you were an advisor to Putin, what would you have suggested he do?
Well, I would not have made these speeches, which he did months and months before the invasion, basically questioning, suggesting that Ukraine is part of Russia, like a czar, and quoting the czars, and going back to czarist history. That's imperialism. I mean, my grandfather was born near the Ukraine border, a Jew under the heel of the Russian czar. So Putin may long for the days of czarist expansion. So no, I'm not going to be an advisor to Putin, but as an internationalist, I would have said diplomacy, don't make these warmongering speeches where you challenge whether the Ukrainians have any right to exist or any right to be an independent people, and don't quote the Tsar, and don't attack Lenin because he was against ultranationalism that you're trying to put forward. I mean, just if you're against imperialism, read the speech that he gave. I believe it was in July. It was like it was 7 or 8 months before the actual invasion of Ukraine. So I believe in multilateral United Nations diplomacy. Help. The U.S. needed to build a bigger movement to stop the expansion of NATO. I've been part of that, but there's no justification for what's happened.
All right.
And by the way, it's made everything in the world worse. It's made climate worse. It's made global militarism worse. The U.S. war machine is thrilled by what Putin did. I'll give you one anecdote.
Yeah.
When the Cold War was over, when the Soviet Union had collapsed, and when the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance of the Eastern Bloc, had disappeared, the U.S. military contractors were freaked out. How are we going to justify that we take all of these resources that should go to working people for us, for our weapons and our wars? And during that period of real dizziness and fear from the war machine, what we call the military-industrial complex, a bunch of military corporations gathered in Wisconsin And the conference was organized before Saddam Hussein in Iraq invaded Kuwait. But the conference happened right after that invasion. What were the opening words at that conference? The MC who started this conference of the military-industrial complex in Wisconsin says, "Thank you, Saddam Hussein." And the place burst into applause. It was like they wild cheering. I would argue that when Putin invaded when Putin invaded Ukraine, the military-industrial, we know it. Their stocks went through the roof. Militarism in our country is on the march. Climate change around the world is on the march. Efforts to rein in big oil in every country is shrinking. So the Russian invasion, just put aside, if you want to apologize for Putin, but even if you don't or do, we know objectively what's happened in the world. It's atrocious on every level. And who knows if the Russians bomb by mistake a nuclear power plant. It's still, we're talking nightmare scenarios here, but nothing good. The military-industrial complex, because of Putin's invasion, is laughing all the way to the bank.
Yeah, but I think, but at the same time, I know that because I think there's been secret documents, but David even told me that Rand Corporation has openly spoken about trying to balkanize Russia, trying to provoke Russia into war and possibly invade Russia so that they can break apart the Russian Federation. And, given that what U.S. imperialism did to Russia after the, dissolving of the USSR with the, with the brutal oligarchy that was Yeltsin. Of course, Putin is also an oligarch, and Yeltsin appointed him as his successor. But I remember watching Oliver Stone's documentary, and Putin said, well, I offered Bill Clinton, why can't we be a part of NATO? And of course, they shot that down. So given that and what the
I know all that,
like to
you're not giving me any new information. It's no justification for Putin's aggression. Putin is a racist right-winger who supports racist movements around Europe. If you watch the Oliver Stone documentary, the interview, as closely as you and I probably did, he's a macho, sexist. He's not a progressive. He's not a friend of the left.
I definitely wouldn't disagree with you on that.
He supports the oligarchy. He's a nationalist. He's an ultra-nationalist. Read the speeches. He's more of a czar than he is a Leninist. So I'm appalled that people who think they're on the left apologize for this right wing. You're right, Yeltsin was a complete US puppet, and then Putin continued the oligarchy. Maybe he gave a little more reform, a little more givebacks to the working class and to pensioners, but he enriched himself and he enriched all his friends. He's an oligarch. He's not a small d Democrat. He's not a socialist in any way. He's a right-winger.
Yeah.
And he loves right-wing regimes around the world. So I guess I'm losing, as you can tell, I'm losing my patience with people on the left who think Putin is their friend.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, we're going to definitely have that debate, definitely sometime in the future. And
all right,
let's just hope that this war ends, because this war has got to end, and the longer it lasts, the worse it gets for the planet. And we do not want nuclear war, because there's no going back for that.
There's no going back on nuclear war. We want this war to end quickly through negotiations. We support negotiations at Roots Action. This war is not going to end by one side conquering the other side. It's absurd. You hear on the US media You know, we got to help Ukraine win and defeat, you know, it's magical thinking. We're in a stalemate. It's a horrific war. It reminds me almost of Vietnam near the end. This is horrific. It's only going to end through the parties talking, and that's where the United Nations has got to be emboldened. And we all remember Victoria Nuland. I don't want to bring that up, but fuck the EU. You know, what the US militarists don't want is for the EU to start showing some independence. They don't want the United Nations to start showing some independence. They don't want anyone to listen to Noam Chomsky, although he was quoted favorably recently in the New York Times when Chomsky says this war is going to end either soon or way down the road after far more suffering through a negotiated settlement. So let's move to a negotiated settlement soon. And that quote was actually, Chomsky was actually referenced positively in the New York Times, which I don't believe has happened in decades. And Chomsky, of course, is the
New York Times aware that Noam Chomsky, you know, some of my criticisms of him aside, some of my disagreements of him aside, is the New York Times aware that Noam Chomsky is anti-NATO and
Totally aware, totally aware. And Chomsky has been, of course, an ally of FAIR.org. Ed Herman was one of our allies. We worked closely.
But you didn't you know, getting into some of the history of FAIR, didn't your organization actually start way before Manufacturing Consent was even released as a book?
Around the same time, yeah. FAIR started in 1986. I think Manufacturing Consent came out within a year or two. But all of us I mean, I was the founder of FAIR with a bunch of associates, and we were all reading Chomsky and Herman. I mean, I've written volumes about this, that I became a media critic as a teenager, partly from reading Noam Chomsky's critiques of the media coverage of the Vietnam War and all the euphemistic language. When Vietnamese were forced into concentration camps, that was called strategic hamlets, which sort of sounded nice. The war at the beginning wasn't called a war, is why I hate Putin so much, you know, a special operation. It was called a conflict, the Vietnam conflict, when the US is going in.
The US was involved as well. They would often use that word, involved.
Right, and you know, there were so many euphemisms, and I became a media critic in part reading Noam Chomsky's early, he's a linguist, criticizing the way the war makers and the US media characterize US aggression in Vietnam. You know, like Chomsky, I'm an anti-US imperialist, but that doesn't mean I praise every regime in the world that's in conflict with US imperialism. I defend people, especially the masses of people, against the crimes of US imperialism without necessarily defending the regimes. We built this huge movement to try to stop the US aggression against Iraq without ever defending anything about the vicious dictator Saddam Hussein.
Yes, very briefly, because I want a response to two things, but very briefly, Julian Assange, what can Americans do to set him free, or at the very least not get him extradited to the United States? Because
the pressure needs to be we at rootsaction.org, and people should join us. Anyone in the world can join rootsaction.org. We've done petitions. We've done, you know, it's Biden's Justice Department. Biden's Justice Department can say, all right, we're not extraditing him. Remember, Biden is a continuation of Obama, for good or bad. And Obama's Justice Department did not indict Assange. They thought about it and they said, we're not doing it. but it was Trump's Justice Department that indicted him for these trumped up charges. It's an attack on freedom of the press. So we're trying to, convince Biden to get, this is one of the rare times Obama did something right by having his Justice Department did something right. They did not bring charges against Assange. We want the charges dropped, and we want the extradition dropped. And that's all in the purview of Joseph Biden and the Justice Department.
So it's up to, so people join Roots.action or even start your own organization to get Julian Assange free. And I really do hope he gets free and not suffer the fates of the Mumia Abu Jamals and the Leonard Peltiers of the world. And then I wanted your response to the Supreme Court ruling overturning abortion. And I've been seeing some very scary headlines that the far right court wants to review gay, gay rights and so forth. So,
right.
So your thoughts on that, and what do you think people should do? Because I know many people feel despondent because they think that, well, it's one thing, going after our own governors of Texas or Arkansas or even a right winger in California, New York. But if the Supreme Court says this is a law of the land, overturns it, I know many people who feel despondent, and some say, I give up on America, let me move to another country. So what would you suggest to the People Power movement?
It's very depressing. I mean, rootsaction.org is obviously fighting on this in defense of reproductive freedom, reproductive rights. We put out an alert today. If anyone signs up, they'll probably get it. And we pointed out something that will never be in the mainstream media, which is that when Barack Obama was campaigning for president in 2007, he went to the Planned Parenthood and he pledged that one of his first acts was going to be to sign the Freedom of Choice Act defending abortion rights and putting it in the law, federal law, not leaving it to the Supreme Court to undo a decision they'd made 49, decades earlier. And that was his pledge. And then in 2019, he was elected with a huge congressional majority. He had a 60-40 majority of Democrats in the US Senate. That's a supermajority. That's a filibuster-proof majority. And he could have codified abortion rights into federal law. And he was asked, and he said, well, Freedom of Choice Act is just not one of my high priorities. So as we pointed out at Roots Action today, the Democrats have had a chance to make this federal law and not just some decision of the Supreme Court that could be undone by the Supreme Court, and the Democrats refused to do it. We have this 6-3 right-wing Supreme Court because Mitch McConnell, the head of the Senate, has stolen 2 seats. Obama, had wanted to appoint someone 9 months before an election. And Mitch McConnell wouldn't allow that. There was plenty of time for the Senate to do its constitutional duty, which is called advise and consent. You have hearings, and you have a vote. But McConnell didn't do that. And then right before the 2020 election, a seat came open. And even while people were voting for president, he rushed through another right-wing appointee. So in a sense, there should be a 5-4 liberal majority on the Supreme Court. Everyone knows it. Mitch McConnell stole 2 seats. So the only alternative, the only way to remedy that, and Roots Action has talked about this as well, is you have to unpack the Supreme Court. Mitch McConnell has packed it with the right wing. So you would have to add, and a bunch of the progressives in Congress have been calling for this for a year or so. You need to add 3 or 4 Supreme Court justices. The number of Supreme Court justices has gone up and down throughout American history. It hasn't changed a lot in modern history, but it's changed throughout. And that would be a solution is, look, McConnell packed the court. We're going to unpack it. And there's other court reforms that can be thought about. I have to run at this moment. It's been a pleasure
All
talking
right,
to you.
no problem.
I encourage people to go to rootsaction.org and fair.org.
No problem. And well, and Jeff, I definitely hope that we can have you back on the program, because
Sure.
I've followed your work for a long time, so it would be an honor to have you back on. And we'll also organize in the future that debates on what
or
the
you
left
and I can debate. I don't care. All right.
Okay.
Nice meeting you.
No
Talk to you
problem.
later.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
And best of luck to everything.
Bye-bye.